Hello everyone, I'm Kay. Today, I'm going to show you how to create a material with a crocodile skin-like effect, basically how to make a leather texture. First, we'll use the tile generator. If you've watched the previous 3 episodes, you'll know this is a familiar tool. We use the tile generator in pretty much all these kinds of pattern arrangement nodes. So here, we set the X amount to 1 and the Y amount to 50, then adjust the size, right? By tweaking the X offset random and the X offset size, you can get an image like this. Then here, we're still using a tile generator to create this black and white alternating pattern. As for the adjustment method, we set both X and Y to 100, and then we tweaked some of its overall parameters a bit here. We also adjusted its scale here, and overall, we set this parameter, which is pretty important, to an offset of 0.5. There it is. The previous row and the next row will shift in a crisscross pattern, so we can get a dotted pattern like this. Then we made another tile generator, and this one is just a small square. Similarly, by adjusting these parameters, you can achieve this effect. So after we finish making these 3 basic shapes, we're going to blend them together. First, we apply a directional blur to this, and the direction is along the x-axis, so that's the 0-degree direction, right? Now, we might not have talked about directional blur before, since earlier we only discussed long uniform blur. Actually, this is similar to long uniform blur. It's actually even simpler because it's really straightforward. You can just adjust the direction of the blur. It only blurs along your chosen axis or in the opposite direction of that axis. And here you can set the intensity, right? So we end up with an image that's been smeared out like this. And it's the same over here. We use this node, and then we blend the 2 layers from these lessons together using a multiply method. Multiplying means white stays white, right? So the white areas remain unchanged, and the black areas get darker, depending on the base image, right? So as you can see, this is what the foreground looks like, and then we multiply it with the background. So the black areas will get darker, right? This part here is black. Okay. Next, we add a levels adjustment below to increase the contrast and refine it. Then, as we can see here, with this node, we're combining our refined node and our small point cloud node using this one. It needs to go into the node to be blended, which means the white areas will show this image and the black areas will show that image. So the 2 images are blended together, right? We're blending them using an alpha channel, basically. Next, we've prepared another node below. This transform node, we've widened it a bit so you can see the shape. If we hold down Alt and Shift like this, wait, that's not right. Hold down Alt. Which key was it again? Control and Shift, right? Control and Shift. That way we can evenly stretch it wider from both sides, right? After widening it, we apply an inverse, which is the second one, inverse grayscale. We're adding a black and white inversion. So then we use this as a mask, right? The white areas will input the smaller particles, and the black areas will input the image we just created. By blending them together as a black and white image, you can see our medium-sized ones. So now we have the largest small squares, the medium-sized small squares, and the smallest small squares, all mixed together into one image. Next, here we apply a global blur. This is a Gaussian blur, which we talked about earlier. It's a very simple blur node, and it works just like how we normally understand blurring. For example, if we try it out, you can see that it produces an even, averaged blur in all directions, right? Let's apply a simple blur, and then here we add a slope blur. As I mentioned before, the slope blur is something that smears from white to black. You can't really see it here, so let me review this node with you again. Wait. Amp, intensity, right, okay. For all these nodes, it's an effect that smears from white, from 1 towards 0, right? And we can adjust its direction, right? So it smears from 1 to 0 like this. Then there are 3 modes: mean, which tries to preserve the black areas as much as possible, max, which tries to preserve the white areas as much as possible, and blur, which is just a simple blur. The higher we set the samples, the more sampling it does, right? So here, when we use slope blur, it uses this black and white image itself to smear from white to black, right? So in effect, we can make the white areas of this base image look like black ink. So as you can see, this produces this kind of, what do you call it? A polygon effect. like a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6-sided shape, right? This is also a hexagon effect. For example, we can turn a rectangle into a hexagon and then make the gaps between them close up to a certain extent, and then use a high contrast filter to keep it, which is basically like extracting its curvature. It's basically a curvature map or an angle map. That is, the areas where the angle changes more drastically will appear black, and where the angle changes less, it'll be white, right? No angle change is black, angle change is white. So it basically extracts this map, and then we apply a level adjustment. The reason we use levels is to make these little crevices more pronounced, right? Because after we extract this curvature, it's like we've increased the black and white contrast of the original image, right? Then, by using a level adjustment, we further enhance that black and white contrast, right? This way, we can extract all those tiny elements one by one. Now, let's add an H-detect node. For the H-detect node, if we input ed as shown in the table, it basically performs edge detection. First, let's turn on this switch, and then we enhance it, and we can see the effect. The original image looks like this, right? When we run the detection, it uses black and white as the edges. If we gradually increase this value and then invert it, we can extract the black and white edges. With the round option, we can turn these extracted black and white edges into a rounded, arc-like shape. You'll get the hang of it once you play around with it a bit. This node is also a very commonly used one. Now, as for our edge detection, the main purpose of calculating it is just to further widen the gap between the black and white areas, so that each section can stand out more independently. Next, we apply a blur, and then using the same method, we do it again and add a slaw blur. The purpose of this is actually to get rid of those small white specks, since white specks don't look good, right? When we blur it, they become less visible, right? Once they're less visible, we repeat the same process with the blur, and those white specks will be nicely removed. Then we move on to the next step. So what does this select, select, select mean? Basically, it means we're gonna select a portion of the pixels. For example, let's take this black and white image as an example. Actually, it's better to use a grayscale image as an example. Contrast, well, I don't need to explain that. Everyone should understand what contrast is. Now, about range, we can see that if the range is zero, it will select everything, right? All the white areas. Then, as you gradually increase it, it will gradually return to the original image's contrast from 0 to 1, right? It returns the original image's contrast from 0 to 1. If you set it all the way to 1, it's basically the inverse of the image. So if we increase the position a bit, we're basically specifying which point will be the end point, and then we use this midpoint to expand outward. For example, if we set this to 0.2. Right, 0.2. So this is basically specifying this line in our regulation map. This line uses a grayscale value of 0.2 as its midpoint, as its position. Then, when we adjust the range, it will expand outward from this position. It will diffuse to other areas, like spreading to pixels with lower or higher values. If it spreads to pixels with higher values than the original image, it's a gradient from white to black. If it's pixels lower than the original image, like black, and you create a gradient, it will gradually restore the original color. So it won't have that gradient effect anymore. But earlier it did, right? So in this case, when we select, it's like we're choosing a portion of the pixels. Let me check here. It's basically like we've made a selection. We've selected the pixels with a value of 1, right? So that's basically the pure white pixels. And we've also set the range to the maximum. When I don't adjust the contrast, there's actually no difference from the original image. But when we set the contrast to 0.42 here, it's like we've increased it. So this is a comparison with the original image, right? Actually, it works pretty similarly to the levels adjustment. The reason we're using this node here is to help everyone get more familiar with it and use it more often. Then we've added a blur and a slope blur, which is basically like cleaning it up again. You can see we've added a histogram select, an HQ blur, and then a slope blur, right? So we've cleaned it up once more. We've cleaned it up again and then repeated the same high pass process as before. After that, we select it again. You can see in this image that we're now able to clearly isolate each of those small individual elements. Through this kind of iterative operation, we've separated out the small elements compared to the image we started with. Compared to this image, you can feel that the quality is a bit better. Let's take a look at this. This one, right? Next, let's move on to the non-uniform line uniform process, which I mentioned earlier. It blurs the white areas while the black areas remain sharp. I'll give you another example here to illustrate this. Anyway, with these kinds of nodes, the more you look at them and use them and the more you review, the easier it is to remember them. That way, you'll be able to recall them when you need to use them. So I don't mind going over this with you all again. Next, about uniform, when we turn it up, you can see, right, in the white areas, the black areas don't get blurred. Then over here, we can adjust its samples, which basically means the highest and lowest sampling values, right? It's just that simple. As for the angle, let's not worry about it for now. I think we used the angle in the previous video segment. If you're interested, you can check out the previous video and the one before that. Now, here we add a level adjustment and then squash it. What does squashing mean? When we slide the middle slider to the left, it actually reduces the contrast. So as you can see in the original image, the black and white contrast is pretty obvious, but in this image, the black and white contrast isn't as pronounced anymore, right? Next, we add a blur effect so that the edges aren't so sharp. If the edges are pixelated, it won't look good when displayed in the image. So by adding a blur, the edges won't be as sharp. Alright, so now the background texture is pretty much done. Let's take a look at what I'm doing with the top layer. This is also a tile generator. I won't go over the tile generator again, just download the file and take a look at the parameters and you'll get the idea. It's the same thing here. As for blending these two, you can just use a simple copy, right? Just a simple copy blend. So why is there a mask here and here? It's because there's something called a cropping area, a cutting range basically. That means we can add something like this. A box mask, basically. You can just add a box mask without having to connect it to this image. Here, I intentionally added this mask to create some variation on both sides. And over here, there's a special effect node called Reaction Diffuse Fast. Honestly, I haven't really figured out exactly how this node works. I don't fully understand its mechanism, but it seems like it can take our black and white pixels, and kind of swirl them together, like this. Swirl them up, right? The reason I'm using this here is just to add a bit of simple texture. Honestly, you could just overlay some noise on it and it wouldn't make much of a difference. And then the direction blur is basically the same as before, right? It's set to 0 degrees, so it's like we're blurring along the x-axis. Then here, I used another blur, and with this, the white areas get blurred while the black areas don't. So it's like we're blurring the base texture. Then, after applying an overall blur earlier, I added a slop blur, and this one has a variation. The main purpose of this is to extract these stripe-like patterns for us, right? It's a blur that transitions from black to white and from white to black, and it's using a max mode. Okay, then here we add a transform. Transform is basically shifting it towards 0.5. In the middle, it's flat, both sides are white, and both sides have more noise. Then we add an HQ blur to soften the edges. You see, the black edge here is still pretty sharp, right? When I apply HQ blur, it blends together like this. So with these two images, we're gonna stack them together, but I haven't stacked them yet. Here, we first apply a warp, using this image as the base. For this image, because it still looks pretty straight and regular, right? If we warp it, we can see that the warping is based on the black and white pixels of our base image. Then we set it to a really, really low value. At this level, we can create an effect that's kind of like depth of field, though it's not exactly the same as the depth of field you get from a camera lens. Here we can add a block, attach it, and then this is how we composite it together. So why do we do this? Why do we need to do the previous step? Actually, it's pretty simple. We need this base texture because after we've created it, its height on the same horizontal plane doesn't change, right? But once we add this base texture, we'll get highs and lows, undulations on the same horizontal plane. So when we combine these two, multiply them together, you can see right here. We can take a look at the actual material. You can see that in the real material, some areas are raised and some are lower. This way, we've added a sense of random texture, and this random texture in the base pattern actually comes from the original image we generated. So to some extent, it matches up with the image we created for the small particles below. For example, if we look at this row, right? For example, if we look at this row, right? This row and this one. These two things, because we applied, what's it called again? A warp, right? You can see, well, I'm not sure if you all can see it clearly. Let's look at this bright area, okay? This bright area, compared to the base pattern here, actually matches up to a certain extent, right? They correspond to each other to some degree. It's just that the degree of correspondence is different. Because here, you can see that this area is brighter toward the end. But if you look at this one without it, the end is actually just a small grain. This creates a kind of randomness, right? That way, the fabric looks more realistic. Then over here, we also applied a slope blur. Slope blur is used when we're making this kind of leather or small blocky things. I've used this technique many times already. I really hope everyone can master it. Then we add a level adjustment to increase its contrast, right? After that, we apply direction warp to add an overall sense of distortion and randomness. Because each of these little pieces, as you can see, are still arranged in a very straight grid-like way, which isn't ideal. So we use a BMW image as the base. This image was discussed in a few earlier lessons, and then we add a directional warp to introduce some distortion. After that, we blur the image and apply an additional blur to it, right? This way, the distortion becomes even more pronounced, making it look all twisted and irregular, which brings out that random skin-like texture. This makes it look more like real biological leather, you know? Biological leather naturally doesn't look like our industrial products, right? It has that randomness. Then we use the levels adjustment to tweak the colors, and after that, we adjust it from different angles, right? Here, we set it to 4, which means each angle gets distorted again. We can compare it with the original image, right? Let's take a closer look at this part. In this area, at every angle, there's a little bit of distortion happening. This multi-directional warp was also discussed in the previous section. Then, for this part, we add a black and white noise pattern and set it to soft light. Soft is actually also a blending mode that changes the image. In the previous 2 chapters, we talked about screen, and actually, the effect of soft and screen isn't all that different. It's just that the overall result with soft might not be as intense as with screen. So I'm not going to go into the details of the algorithm here. Just remember this. Soft is about as strong as screen, and their algorithms are pretty similar. That's all you need to know. Now, as for our height map, it's basically done. Next, you'll see here that we need to set a histogram range. The histogram range is basically used to control the range of the height map, right? The height. Take a breath. We've talked about this node before. The first range actually controls its contrast. You can see that with leather, for example. You might want the contrast to be higher or lower, right? Whether you want it to pop out more or sink in a bit, that's what you adjust here, right? Then the position below actually controls its brightness, right? You can see the brightness being adjusted higher or lower, and then with this image, we've generated things like height, normal, and AO maps. For the AO, we set it really low, like 0.001, right? Because this leather itself isn't very heavy. So the AO definitely needs to be subtle. And with that, we've got the height, normal, and AO all sorted out. Now let's talk about color. First, we converted this height map into a normal map and then used the normal map's curvature to generate another map. This is called a curvature map. The curvature map is generated from your normal map, and as you can see, it highlights the bumps and dents, turning them into a black and white curvature map. There are actually 2 types of curvature. One is curvature smooth, and the other is just curvature. The difference between them is that curvature smooth is a bit more blended and softer. This one's a bit sharper, right? And the smooth one, if we set a level for it, basically after generating the curvature map, we want to extract the areas with lower curvature. So where are the low curvature areas in this image? They're on the smoother surfaces, right? Those areas have lower curvature. So when we extract a smooth curve, we use the level setting. Then, by increasing the contrast a bit, we can extract the mask for these small, flat surfaces. Once we've extracted it, then, as usual, we take an image. Let's use this one as the base layer, right? First, we lay down a black and white alternating base. Next, we add a curvature map and set it to screen mode. Then we add a brightness contrasted base, right? You can see here, after you increase the screen blending, the whole, the flat areas will become brighter and the colors will be more distinct. Then we add an SHV adjustment for color grading. Over here, we use a his ground select. This image is used a lot. Basically, we select 0.79, a grayscale area at 0.79, right? The original image's 0.79 grayscale area is used as the mask. Now, the 0.79 grayscale in the original image is actually a relatively dark area, right? The higher the value, the darker the selected part will be, so you can capture certain crevices or gaps. So here, if we apply an HSL adjustment to this image, it's like we've isolated the areas in the gaps and created a separate mask for them. Then, by blending it with the original image, you can see the gaps in these areas. There will be some changes, though it might not be very clear to see. Hopefully, everyone can download the file and try it out for yourselves, then you'll understand. Okay, next we're going to do another color blend. This one is for an even deeper gap, and we've used a much higher contrast for it, right? And the position is also set further back, which means it will pick up a darker value. Then, inside the small black gap, we've added another color. You can see that the small black gap now has some color in it. There's a tiny yellow pixel here. I'm not sure if everyone can see it clearly. With this, we can take our highlight, the midtone, and the darkest area, and in this way, we have a mix of 3 colors. Plus, with the blend we added at the very beginning, that's a mix of 4 colors. With this, we can use this image. The randomness is already sufficient. Then, over here, we add an HSL and a level adjustment. These are for color grading. Finally, we output everything through an output car node, and that's it. Alright, once we've got the colors sorted out, next let's look at its metallic and roughness properties. Since it's originally leather, I didn't set any metallic value, but if you want, you can turn up the metallic to make it look like metallic leather, kind of like that style. There are also fabrics like this, more of a cyberpunk style, you know? Cyberpunk fabrics can have that metallic look too. So here, we're working with these 2 images. One is for the raised areas, and the other is for the deepest parts. We use them as a mask, and then combine them with the original image. Let me check which one it is. We take the original image, the base image, and blend it together. After blending, we get a basic roughness variation. Then we mix in some of the darkest areas, right? For the darkest areas, we want the roughness to be a bit lower, so we make them really white, right? Actually, using screen mode or just adding them together makes it even whiter. If you use this method, it looks completely different, right? So we use screen. With screen, we make this area even whiter, and then we use a levels adjustment to increase the contrast between black and white. So the black areas become rougher and more reflective, while the white areas are not reflective. This way, especially when you look at the body here, you can really see the effect. It's these areas here, this one, and this one. You can clearly see there's a difference in roughness. This way, there's variation in size, depth, light and dark, and then changes in texture. That's what makes something look good, right? And with that, the rough map here is finished. All right, so that's the whole process for making this crocodile skin. You're welcome to follow my public account to download the original file. That's it for this video. Bye, everyone.